and I will be talking about the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement and promoting democracy, and I've already put it in between brackets because anybody who knows the political context of Singapore is already rolling their eyes of what are you trying to do. So, the setting of the agreement is, it's a new agreement. Negotiations were actually, the legal scrubbing, as they call it, of the investment chapter was just finalized last May, a month ago, starting in 2010. The agreement is pending ratification, and the previous commissioner, Karel de Gucht, sent it to the Court of Justice to sort out some competence issues. And the current trade commissioner confirmed that the agreement needs to, that the Court of Justice needs to make a decision on who is competent over what. But this is, of course, slowing down the ratification of the agreement, and Singapore is not really happy with that. The long-term initiative for a bilateral free trade agreement with the EU actually came from Singapore already 10 years ago. I think Maria already has written an article on that, how in 2004 already they were the ones asking, like, let's have a bilateral free trade agreement. The EU didn't want to go in that way, but now it's come to be this way. Katarina already explained to you how interregionalism is now a bilateral agreement. It's the second one in Asia after South Korea, which is also very important for the EU's visibility in Asia, and the first one with an ASEAN member. It's framed as a building block for the other ones, which is concerning the economy and the kind of exports that Singapore has. Isn't really true, but it's there, and there's a framework for negotiations with other countries. What I think is interesting and also important to mention is that there is a lot of EU business in Singapore, and they were actually also one of the drivers to get the EU on board to have this, to start negotiating. So it's actually, in some way, the EU negotiating an agreement with Singapore for the benefit of some of these companies over there, so they can export back to the European Union. So that's a very interesting dynamic. So what does it mean? It's the institutionalization of the relations between the EU and Singapore, the trade relations. And it's a framework for my research. I realized that a new free trade agreement is new empirical material, and I think a lot of us want to know more about it. But I will point to some important issue on the domestic context of Singapore. I've read many books and many articles on how do you call Singapore? What is it? Is it soft authoritarianism, which is weird? Is it electoral democracy? Because they have elections, but they're not really free and fair, so it's very complicated. But they're not a democracy in any of our Western standards, which is also important to mention. It's very rich country. It's richer than Switzerland. In the EU, only Luxembourg has more money than Singapore, even per capita. But also there's an increasing inequality. They have very, very bad scores on equality. They have limited freedoms. There is very limited freedom of speech. If you criticize government, you might end up in court. You probably will lose, and you will become bankrupt because you will have to pay damages. So it's a kind of subtle, they don't really put people in prison over their political activism, but they will make sure that you cannot run for office, because if you're bankrupt, you cannot run for office in Singapore. There is a limited freedom to associate. Unions, it's very government organized. Freedom of press is completely not there, so that's very important. Of course, this, as Singapore, is the typical example of the Asian values discourse. It's very 90s of me to still refer to it, but it's still very active, and it's still how they frame their position in the world. So the Asian values discourse is claiming that the liberal democracy that we have in the West does not fit the Asian context, because they have Western ideals are mainly focused on individual and individual rights, whereas Asian values mainly focus on the benefit of the community of coming to compromise. Here's a picture of Lee Kuan Yew. He recently passed away. He's literally the father of Singapore, which also links to the paternalistic kind of system that they have, the discourse that ordinary people are not necessarily fit to decide on politics. That's actually how the system works. More specifically, that again linking with trade, and to give an example of how Singapore functions, is that Lee Kuan Yew, allegedly what he did, explained to South Korean policymakers, this is in the beginning of the like 70s, 80s, because South Korea was very closed and did not, they promoted investment from within the country, so they wanted to have Korean businesses flourish in Korea. That was the point. And Singaporean leaders said, well, no, you shouldn't do that. You should have foreign investment in your country, because what will happen if you have flourishing businesses of Korean ownership, these people will become rich, and at one point they will want a voice in a political system, and you want to avoid that. So this is his motivation for all this foreign investment that's going on in Singapore. So my research question is how these two things interact. I'm not as naive to think that the EU can promote democracy in Singapore. Claire also mentioned it, a lot of social clauses in trade literally are like a rhetoric or are just to make it nice. So that's not really, the promoting part is not really going to happen. But I still want to see how that interacts, also because I think it's important for the rest of the ASEAN countries. Also the agreement with Vietnam is actually a similar context of how do you negotiate with an undemocratic country, and what does that say about our role in Asia? The theoretical setting, and I was really happy with your question earlier on how economic liberalization then ends up with a higher GDP for a country, and then automatically you would end up in political liberalization. That's the modernization theory. There has been a lot of more literature, many critiques, many confirmations on this like structure of economic liberalization leading to political liberalization. And my point is that the EU and its trade policy with third countries, especially in Asia, far away, functions in this kind of framework of trade modernization theory. It's kind of complicated, still working. But the main thing is like trading is good for you. If you trade with us, you will learn valuable lessons on governance, and this will be good for the openness of your country. In a way, the EU is very explicit about that. They try to engage civil society on the agreement. They link it with a political agreement that also mentions human rights, a human rights dialogue. They focus on sustainable development, so these are all concepts that are very much interlinked. They're also implicit in their discourse, in the assumption that economic liberalization is very much linked with political liberalization. And somewhere in between, the free trade agreements are there to promote accountability, rule of law. They're all very dodgy legal terms most of the time, but it's the point in the agreement most of the time. So the free trade agreement is my framework for research, which makes me engage with the existing trade literature, basically what all of you have been writing. Thanks for that. And interact and maybe conflict with the existing democratization literature on economic liberalization, which functions mostly top-down, and political liberalization, which can also be top-down, but is in essence supposed to be bottom-up. So for this specific context of the Singapore agreement, I'm going to, I already have established a detailed timeline of the negotiations, because that's part one, like how do you negotiate with a non-democratic country. I identify the stumbling blocks, and then also try to see the input of civil society, because it will be weird to look at democracy aspects in Singapore and not look at them in the EU. Then in future times look at the implementation, how does civil society dialogue work, and most importantly, who benefits, because that is actually my main argument, that through a free trade agreement and through increasing wealth for Singapore, you're actually consolidating the situation as it is now, because the civil society dialogue is not enough to change the political context. Thanks. So that actually is what I want to do in this chapter and this part of my research. But then further on, I make a similar case for two other countries in the ASEAN, two other types of trade relations. Again, two non-democratic countries where the EU has some kind of trade relation with, to see how the negotiation works, how the process works, what the discourse and the framework is for the EU to negotiate with these countries. I won't go into detail because I don't have enough time, but it's very interesting to see, like in Malaysia, how the EU uses a kind of trade logic to deal with other problems, and how all these things interact. So that's actually, again, a summary of what, for the whole research on the framework, is that the EU is functioning, has this discourse, has this ideology within the modernization theory framework, and where I look at both the negotiation process of how that maybe conflicts, and what the implications of the implementation are. So that's about it. I hope for your input and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both speakers for keeping to the time. That means we have just under 15 minutes for